Good afternoon or good morning, whatever it is. Hope you're enjoying your time with your break, and thanks for joining me today to talk about prompts 2 and 3 of Task 1 of the Planning Commentary. Prompts 2 and 3 are associated with both rubrics 2 and 3. And to do well with this presentation, you need to have out your handbook and be looking at prompts 2 and 3 and rubrics 2 and 3. And you can pause the video and get those materials out. So the whole idea about prompts 2 and 3 is to help you showcase how well you can plan for diverse learners. And a lot of you came to my workshop back in the fall called No Cookie Cutter Classrooms. And if you didn't come, I think that it would be well worth your time to click on this link here and stop and, when you get a minute before you start writing 2 and 3, take some time and look through No Cookie Cutter Classrooms and see if that might be of some use to you. I think it will be. So what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be writing about in prompt 2, we're writing to describe our students. And then in prompt 3, we write about how we plan to meet the needs of those students. Now remember, you want to try to stick with your central focus. Sometimes though, that's kind of a stretch, and that's okay. You just really want to really describe your students. So in your the prompt says to cite evidence of what students know, what they can do, and what they are still learning to do as related to the central focus. So this is where they're looking for you to describe the prior academic learning and the prerequisite skills that are related to the central focus. So in paragraph 1, you're going to describe what your students already know. And you need to give evidence. So, for example, if you say that your students already know how to add 2 one-digit numbers, how do you know they can do that? What evidence do you have? Is it a little quiz that you gave them, or have you observed this? I mean, what are you using in order to say that? So when we say evidence, we're wanting you to support how you know the students can do what you say they do. Then in paragraph 2, describe what your students can do. Now, what they can do is different than what they know. So we're not just talking about skills. We're talking about knowledge and skills. And how do you know that they can do those things? Describe what the students are still learning to do. Well, we know that they can add 2 one-digit numbers. They get a little mixed up when but they're still working on maybe subtraction. Subtraction's not as easy for them. Or maybe they're doing, well with words that have a short A, but words that have a short O are giving them difficulty. So what are they still learning? They're still developing. And again, how do you know that? Now, here, this for paragraph 1, 2, and 3, we're talking about your class as a whole. And that's important. So you're going to be teaching the whole class. So you want to talk about where the class is as a whole. When you get down here to paragraph 4, start thinking about individuals or groups. So if you have an individual in your classroom who's significantly different in where they are in their learning from the others, maybe advanced or maybe behind, then you need to talk about where that learner is. Or if you have a group of individuals that's significantly ahead or behind, then you need to talk about what these groups can do, what they can't do, what they're still learning to do. Now, it's important that in this section, you don't begin talking about what your plans are to address you're just describing the students. You're not yet talking about how you're going to address these needs. That comes in prompt 3. And if you answer it now, then when you get to prompt 3, you're going to think, well, I've already written that, and you won't write like you should. So it's important to just stick to what you're supposed to be talking about here. Remember that. Okay. Prior academic learning and prerequisite skills. This is one student's what they wrote. The students know how to read complex text and look for the words and details. Blah, 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 blah. My students can read a text and answer text-based questions. Miss Rock can't read. Answer text-based questions. They're still learning to find the meaning and relate the information. Then they go on to talk about that even stuck in some, even though it's not asked for here, they've put in some research. My students who have IEPs are able to read independently. They have trouble finding. So this person has used the organization that I'm presenting here, and this person also did very well with this question. So when we get to 2B, we're no longer talking about how the students are working on, we're no longer talking about prerequisite learning. We're not talking about prior learning anymore. We're talking about personal, cultural, and community assets. And before I go on, let me go back just a second, because I meant to mention that one of the things that you ought to do if you haven't done, if you get a chance to do, then right before you teach this learning segment, it would be great if you could get what we call baseline data. So if you could give some kind of pre-test that talks about how the students how some sort of pretest that tells what they can do. Then you can, first of all, talk about it in evidence, and then you've just really got some good sound stuff. But you don't have to do that if you've got other ways to say, I've observed this, or we've done these sets of problems, or whatever you want to do. But you just need to, I'm just saying that is a good suggestion. And along that line, if you haven't already, it would be great to do an interest inventory or an interest survey with your students. For example, finding out what they like to do outside of school. Now, this is important because a lot of times when we start talking about the things our students like to do, people like to say, well, this one likes to do this here at school. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what kind of experiences do they have outside of school? And that way we can make their learning more relevant to their lives, because their lives aren't in school. So you want everyday experiences outside of school. You want to write about their cultural backgrounds and practices. The community description. For example, is your community poor? Is it rural? Is it known for something? For example, Bristol's known for NASCAR, and you've got the Gray Fossil site. So what are some community assets that we have here? Now, I've talked a lot about assets in no cookie cutter classroom. So again, if you're struggling with figuring this out, it might be good to go and talk about that. Now, again, this is not asking you to write what you're planning to do about these things. You're still just describing your students. Here's someone's work. They wrote, the students in this classroom convey various interests, talents, experiences. They talk about all the things they like to do, talk about being in Title I school. 90% of the students indicate they have piggy banks at home. the community built. So it's just, a lot of interesting information. When you get to 2C, this is only for math. Math has to write about mathematical dispositions. So dispositions has to do with students' feelings and attitudes toward math. So, for example, what they're wanting to know is how your students perceive math. Do they think of math as sensible, useful, and worthwhile? And if you believe that they do, what do you base that on? So you could actually ask your students this, in a mathematical survey, or you could go around and interview them, or do some kind of little group thing where you talked about math. Describe how your students persist in applying mathematics to. So a lot of times with math, it's not so much anything but just dogged persistence. Who sticks with it, who's got grit, and sticking with it to solve the problems is important. And also believing in their own ability to learn math. So you want to talk about all of these things that are in A, B, and C, and you want to not just say, my students find it useful. Tell me how you know that. How do you know they find it useful? How do you know that they are persistent? What have you observed? And here's an example of how a person wrote this up. My students get excited to learn new math concepts and apply what they learn to their everyday lives. I often hear them in the afternoon during recess singing the song we had learned in math. I just love this answer. They also mention often, and she puts in quotes, I knew the answer because I used my math strategies. So this is great. And notice how this person has bolded these terms: sensible, useful, and worthwhile. This is important because what this does is it draws the scorer's attention. Now I want you to look how easy this is to read. Whenever our paragraphs are broken like this, broken apart with a space, it's not as hard to read. It just makes it much easier. And even though the people who read your stuff are smart, they're human and they get tired. So that's what we have to do for 2. For 3, now we begin to talk about how we're going to use what we learned, what we know about our students. We're going to take the information that we present in 2A, 2B, and if you're math, 2C. And you're going to tell how you're going to use and address and expand on these things in your learning segment. You're going to write at least 2 paragraphs. Math people, you need to plan to write 3 paragraphs. In your first paragraph, how did your knowledge of students' prior learning guide your instructional choices? So, for example, you knew that they were able to do one thing really well, but they had a weakness somewhere else. How did you use that in your planning? So you refer to actually what you said in 2A. So you go back to 2A and you say, okay, what were some things that I said about my student? Now come back and talk about those again. Reference your lesson plan. Say things like, as you can see in lesson plan 2, I added blah, 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 blah. Or you can say, if you can see in my instructional materials on day 3, I gave the students a specific support to blah, blah, blah. And then you justify your response with research and theory. And this research and theory is just like we saw that earlier student had put in parentheses a researcher's name with a date. Actually, just the researcher's name is sufficient. A date is not necessary. But using research to back up your response, even without a footnote, is very powerful. And it's what gets your score from a 3 up to a 4 or a 5. And then in paragraph 2, you're going to talk about how your knowledge of students' personal lives and their community and culture guided your instructional choices. And you're going to refer to the evidence now that you wrote about in 2B. Now, math, you're going to either put it in this paragraph, but I would suggest a third paragraph, and talking about your mathematical dispositions in a third paragraph, where you're going to refer to the evidence that you presented in 2C. But again, for each paragraph, you need to reference your lesson plans and your instructional materials, and you need to justify your response with research and theory where you can. So here's an example of a student. My knowledge of students' prior learning guided my instructional choices because I knew that they had a foundation for the information. So she talks about how she knew that. And then she says this lesson takes the skill that they already had a step further. And then she goes on to talk about how they enjoy technology and so what she did about that. And then here at the end, she adds in her research, Gardner, 1983. Then this is another example. And so since my students have previously learned the meaning of the equal sign and place value, this helped to guide my instruction and choice of learning tasks. Students will just need a refresher on the meaning of the equal sign rather than another lesson dedicated to it. So you see, she talks about how she made these instructional decisions based on where the students were. And then she talks about here, she just makes such a good argument. This is appropriate because Bandura's social learning theory suggests that people learn from one another via blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so it's all really good. And she talks about how they love animals. And so she did the less than and greater than with the alligator, and alligator, alligator, which one will you eat, with the song. And so it's all really great. Good job. So describe through 3B is where you describe and justify your instructional strategies and plan supports that are appropriate for the whole class, individuals, groups, and students with specific learning needs. So in this one, what you want to do is that you want to start talking about where you added in your supports. Now, think big with the support. So if you used a Venn diagram, or if you used I couldn't think of the word, anchor chart, or if you had a word wall, or if you were letting the students work with partners, whatever you did, teaching strategies. Notice it's not just supports, but teaching strategies. So if you chose a particular strategy or planned a specific support, and I know you did because you've planned the best 3 lessons that you possibly can. So what you're going to do now is write about it. Paragraph 1, what objectives of which lesson are you supporting? So first of all, what objective is being supported? Describe your strategies and supports for the whole class, and then justify them based on learning needs. So if you said, for instance, that my students are still struggling with blah, 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 then what did you do then to help the whole class learn? And then justify with strategies and supports. Now do the same thing with specific groups. Let's say you've got a group in your class that's really advanced and learns really a whole lot more quickly than everybody else. Did you plan something special for those groups? Do you have a strategy or support for them? What are you going to do when those students finish their work early? Can they go to a center? Or what about your students who are really struggling? Do you have an instructional aid that's coming in, or is that person going to be paired with a stronger learner? What's your plan? And then you've got specific individuals. So that's specific groups would be like if you have 2 individuals with the same need or a similar need. Well, suddenly you've gone from individuals to groups, right? So when it's just one, it's an individual. More than one, what's the same, then it's a specific group. But you want to make sure you bring in the research and theory and justify your supports. And this tells you how to organize it. You can see that it's a lot. And so the whole class is provided with, and she goes on to a lot of things that she's done. It's really, really good. If you want to pause this and read it, I think that's a really good idea. And then she talks about the differentiated strategies that she's done for lessons 2 and 3. Then she's come down here and started talking about her struggling learners and students with IEPs, what kind of accommodations they had. And so this is just excellent. And this person did do really well. So if you want to pause and read and see what that was, that was really good. So now we're going to look at 3C. And 3C is for math. Well, actually, we have it for math and for literacy. But so for math, what you're going to do is that you're going to describe common mathematical preconceptions, errors, or misunderstandings within your central focus. Now, you may not know what this is, of what these common preconceptions are. I can tell you from teaching elementary school, when I taught math, there was always students, for some reason, that could not seem to learn the difference between the greater than, less than sign. They just could not get it. I don't know what it was, a left-right thing, or how they interpreted it. I mean, I don't know, but that was a common problem. So that's really what you're looking for, is you're thinking about what kind of common problem you expect there's going to be. And you don't have to be right. I mean, you can think that they're going to have problems with something and they end up not, but in your planning, how did you plan with that in mind? And very similarly, here in literacy, you want to describe common developmental approximations or common misconceptions within your literacy central focus and how you will address them. So, common developmental approximations or common misconceptions. So, for example, you know how students will see Illinois and they'll say Illinois. That's one that has to do with reading. So how do you plan to deal with these things? You can also, when you come across terms like common developmental approximations, the best thing to do is to look for those in your glossary or in your understanding rubric level progressions, because that's where you're going to get a better definition than what I actually can give you, because I'm not a content expert. So you're going to you want to reference your lesson plans. So this prompt is very straightforward, and it's there really just to help you make a 5. So leaving it out is kind of silly. I would always make an attempt to answer this. Okay, so here's someone's answer. A common misconception within my literacy central focus may be comparing and contrasting the fictional character and Jackie Robinson instead of a blah, 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 blah. So she goes on to describe and look again how this is bolded. That's very good because it draws the eye of the scorer down to where it needs to be. Good job. You can take a few minutes and read that if you'd like. Now what I want to do is talk with you about the rubrics. Now, so with rubric one was directly associated with prompt 1, but prompts 2 and 3 are a little mixed up. They're not quite that way. Parts of rubric 2, you're going to be using the information from prompt 2 and some from prompt 3, and then it's just a little backwards. So we're going to look at that. So first of all, the evidence for rubric 2 comes from your context for learning. That's what CFL stands for, context for learning. It comes from prompt 2, and it comes from prompt 3B. First of all, you want to make sure that you attend or you pay attention and comment on the instructional requirements that are in any of the IEPs and 504 plans. That's what your context for learning is going to tell the score, is if you had anything in there that should have been addressed. Not doing that gives you an automatic 1, so you need to double check that. Evidence from 2A, 2B, and 3A, the evidence from those is what we use for Rubric 3. And you will get an automatic 1 there if you have a deficit view. So a deficit view means that you view a student through their deficits rather than their assets. So, of course, asset deficit, you can kind of figure that one, sounds pretty good and one doesn't. So if, for instance, you say things like, my students could learn if they didn't come from such poor homes, that means that you are viewing the students from their poverty instead of viewing them as individuals who may happen to be poor. But you don't want to do that. It's very negative. It takes you completely out of the equation. Why do we even have teachers then if everything depends on what goes on in the home? So we know that we can make a difference in students' lives, and that's why we're here. Okay. You also want to make sure, I thought I don't, but you also want to make sure that your plan supports are tied to the learning objectives and that you have attention to the characteristics at the whole. This is all about plan supports tied to the learning objectives. So that's really important because look at that, tied to learning objectives. So you want to make sure that the supports that you use, you actually say, this was my objective and this was how I was supporting it. And then you want to talk about how you supported the needs of specific groups and individuals. And then this is how you get your misconceptions in there for your 5. Down here, you want to justify learning based on their prior academic learning, their personal, cultural, and community assets. There it is. Now, the difference between a 2 and a 4 or a 3 and a 4 is that here you have to, in order to get a 4, you have to justify why the learning tasks are appropriate using examples of your students' prior academic learning and personal, cultural, or community assets. Now, it's important to recognize that you don't have to do personal, cultural, and community assets, but you do need to do personal, cultural, or. So one of those and this is how you justify the learning tasks. You want to make connections to research and theory. That's how you go from get from to a 3 and then a 4, and of course you have to have a 4 and even better for a 5. So they want the difference here. This is connections are made, but here you're just much, much stronger in your connections. I know it's a little confusing, but we'll look at some examples when we look at the understanding rubric level progression. Okay, so that brings us to the end of rubric 2, rubric 3, prompt 2 and prompt 2 and prompt 3. Remember to keep it separate. Don't confuse what you're supposed to write about. I would like for you to go ahead and stop the recording and take time to write your prompt 2 and prompt 3, and take a look at not only the rubrics for prompt 2 and prompt 3, but take a look also at the Understanding Rubric Level Progressions document, because it can help you see what specific kinds of things need to be added in order to do well. Okay, see you next time. Bye.